Welcome to our deep dive. And today we'll be talking all about botulism. You know, that illness you always hear about, but may not know that much about.
That's right.
So we've got some really interesting medical articles,
Yeah,
and we're going to try to dispel some of those common myths about it.
absolutely. There are definitely some misconceptions out there.
Now, I've been looking through these, and let me tell you, it's not just bad canned goods. There are a lot more ways to encounter botulism than you might think.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So to kick things off, let's get back to the basics. What exactly is botulism?
Well, it's a serious illness, but it's preventable, and that's the good news. It's caused by a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum.
Okay.
Now, this bacteria, it thrives in environments without much oxygen.
So like sealed cans.
Exactly, or even a deep wound. And the real danger is the neurotoxins it produces. These are some of the most potent poisons we know.
Oh, wow.
They attack your nervous system, disrupt those signals that control your muscles, and ultimately
Paralysis. So it's much more serious than I thought. How many ways are there to actually encounter these toxins?
well, you might be surprised, but there are 5 main types of botulism.
5.
Yeah, and some of them are pretty unexpected. Most people know about food-borne botulism, improperly canned foods, bulging lids, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the classic image.
Right, but there's more to it than that. Then you've got infant botulism, actually the most common form in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, it happens when babies, usually under 12 months old, ingest the spores of C. botulinum.
The spores, not the toxin itself.
Right, and these spores can germinate in their intestines and start producing the toxin.
I see. So what about the honey connection? That's what they always say to watch out for with babies, right?
Exactly. Honey is a common source of those spores, which is why it's a big no-no for babies under a year old.
Got it. No honey for the little
Yeah.
ones. So what other ways can you get botulism besides food and babies?
Well, believe it or not, wounds can be a source. This is more common in people who inject drugs, as the bacteria can get into the wound and, you guessed it, start producing those toxins.
Wow. Never would have thought of that one.
Then there's a rare form called iatrogenic botulism. It happens when someone receives too much botulinum toxin during a medical procedure.
Like a Botox overdose.
You got it.
That's both terrifying and kind of ironic.
Right. And last but not least, there's adult intestinal toxemia. Similar to infant botulism, but it occurs in adults. It's less common, but still something to be aware of.
Okay, so food, babies, wounds, Botox overdoses, and adult intestinal issues. That is quite the range. But let's say someone does get botulism. What does that look like? What symptoms should they be on the lookout for?
Well, the symptoms, they can vary depending on the type of botulism, but there are some common signs to watch out for. You might notice drooping eyelids, blurred or double vision, slurred speech, trouble swallowing.
Sounds a lot like someone who's had a few too many drinks.
It can mimic that, you're right at first. But here's where it gets serious. The muscle weakness progresses to paralysis. And eventually it can affect your breathing, which can lead to respiratory failure.
Wow. Okay, this is no joke. So botulism can actually be life-threatening if it's not treated quickly.
Absolutely.
What about infants? Do they experience different symptoms?
Yeah, infants with botulism often have a weak cry, they have trouble feeding, and they have what's called a floppy appearance because of the muscle weakness.
Floppy baby. That's one I won't soon forget. So how is botulism diagnosed and treated if you suspect you have it?
Diagnosing botulism, it involves a few different things. Doctors look at your symptoms, take your medical history, and run some lab tests. They'll look at blood, stool, even food samples if they think there's a food source.
So it's kind of a detective process.
Exactly. And sometimes they might use electromyography or EMG to measure muscle activity, or even a mouse bioassay.
A mouse bioassay. What is that?
It's basically where they inject mice with a sample from the patient and see if they develop symptoms. It's a very sensitive test, although a bit old school.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. All right. So let's say you're diagnosed with botulism. Then what? What does the treatment look like?
Well, the primary treatment is an antitoxin. It neutralizes those toxins in your system. However, it's really important to note that it doesn't reverse any nerve damage that's already happened.
So it stops things from getting worse, but it doesn't heal the damage.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. That's important to know.
Supportive care is also really important, especially for those having trouble breathing. They might need ventilation to help them breathe.
That makes sense. Is the treatment the same for infants?
Infants actually receive a specialized antitoxin called botulism immune globulin, or Baby Big for short. It's designed specifically for their needs.
Baby Big. Catchy name. All right, so we've talked about the different types, the symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment. That's a lot of info,
Yeah.
but I think everyone's really here for the myth-busting, right?
Let's do it.
Myth number 1. Botulism only comes from canned food. True or false?
Definitely false. We talked about wound botulism, infant botulism from honey, even Botox injections. So while improperly canned foods are a common culprit, they're definitely not the only way to get botulism.
Okay, good to know. So it's not just about those bulging cans. Myth busted. Next up, refrigeration prevents botulism. True or false?
Another myth. Refrigeration helps slow down bacterial growth, but it doesn't destroy any toxins that are already in the food.
So even if I've got that questionable jar of salsa chilling in my fridge, it could still be harboring those nasty toxins.
That's right, you can't rely on refrigeration alone.
Good to know. All right, final myth for this round. Heating food always destroys the botulism toxin. What do you think?
This one's a bit tricky. While heat can inactivate the toxin, it needs to be a good long boil, at least 10 minutes, to be effective.
So a quick zap in the microwave isn't going to do the trick.
Nope, to be safe, you really need to boil those home canned foods for a good 10 minutes before eating them.
All right, 3 myths busted. We're on a roll. Now for something a bit different, you mentioned fish can be a source of botulism.
That's right, even in well-regulated markets, there's still a small risk of botulism from fish, especially those that are smoked, lightly preserved, or vacuum-packed.
Hold on, fish. Seriously. I thought it was more of a shellfish thing.
Well, remember how C. botulinum loves those low-oxygen environments? Certain fish products can create those conditions if they aren't processed or stored properly.
Okay, interesting. But also a little concerning. What should I be watching out for with fish?
Well, the good news is C. botulinum and its toxins are destroyed by heat. So cooking fish to an internal temperature of at least 70 degrees Celsius or 158 Fahrenheit is essential.
Yeah.
But here's something interesting. These bacteria can grow at temperatures as low as 3.3 degrees Celsius or 37 Fahrenheit.
Wait, 37 degrees? That's basically my refrigerator temperature.
Exactly. So proper refrigeration below 4 degrees Celsius or 39 Fahrenheit is super important. And be extra cautious with vacuum-packed fish, especially if you're not sure how it's been stored or if it's past its expiration date.
So much to think about when it comes to fish. Cook it thoroughly, refrigerate it properly, and watch out for anything that looks or smells off.
Got it.
We've covered a lot of ground here today. Botulism, clearly a serious illness, but it seems like there's a lot we can do to protect ourselves.
You got it.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
All right, that brings us to the end of part 1 of our botulism deep dive. We busted some myths, learned about the science, and even delved into the world of fish-related risks. But we're not done yet. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into the preventative measures you can take to safeguard yourself and your family. We'll be back soon, so stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive on botulism. Now that we've got the basics down, let's talk about prevention. How can we use all this knowledge to stay safe in our everyday lives?
Well, knowing about botulism is one thing, but putting that knowledge into action is what really matters.
Right, so where do we start?
Let's break down some prevention strategies, starting with the most obvious one, food safety.
Food Safety 101. Always a good place to start. What are the key things to remember when it comes to botulism?
Proper canning techniques are absolutely crucial. You really want to make sure you're following trusted recipes, using the right equipment, and making sure those jars are properly sealed.
No cutting corners when it comes to canning, got it. What about those bulging cans we talked about?
Yeah, bulging cans, leaking cans, any can that smells off, toss it. Don't even think about opening it.
Better safe than sorry, right? What about just basic hygiene in the kitchen?
It might seem obvious, but always, always wash your hands thoroughly before handling food, especially when you're working with raw ingredients.
Right, basic hygiene, but so important. Anything else we should be thinking about in the kitchen?
Remember our myth-busting session? Refrigeration doesn't actually kill the botulism toxin, so even if you've stored your food in the fridge, you still need to heat it thoroughly before eating.
Right, that good rolling boil for 10 minutes.
Exactly, especially for those home-canned foods.
Okay, so we've got food safety down. What about those less obvious sources of botulism, like wounds?
Good point. When it comes to wounds, especially deep ones or puncture wounds, keeping them clean is key. And seek medical attention if needed.
Even if it's a minor cut?
Well, it's always better to err on the side of caution. If a wound is deep, dirty, or not healing properly, get it checked out.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Now, what about babies? We already know honey's a no-go, but are there other precautions parents should take?
Besides avoiding honey for those under 12 months, It's also important to be aware of other potential sources of botulism spores, like soil and dust.
So good hygiene practices all around, really.
Exactly. Frequent hand washing, especially after changing diapers or being outdoors, it can really help protect babies.
Makes sense. Okay, food safety, wound care, baby hygiene, all checked off. Now let's talk fish.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Fish, delicious, but potentially risky.
We learned earlier that even well-regulated markets can't totally eliminate the risk.
That's true, but there are things you can do to minimize that risk.
Okay, so how do we enjoy our fish without worrying about botulism?
The number one rule: cook your fish thoroughly. At least 70 degrees Celsius or 158 Fahrenheit internally.
So no sushi then?
Well, sushi from reputable restaurants is generally considered safe. They use high-quality fish and follow strict protocols. But if you're preparing it at home, always err on the side of overcooking.
Got it. No sushi risks for me. What about refrigeration? We know that sea botulism can grow at some pretty low temperatures.
Right, so proper refrigeration is super important. Keep your fish below 4 degrees Celsius or 39 Fahrenheit, and don't leave it out at room temperature for too long.
Especially those vacuum-packed ones.
Exactly. Vacuum-packed fish can be a bit tricky. That lack of oxygen creates an ideal environment for sea botulism to grow.
What about those prepackaged smoked salmon platters?
Well, if they've been stored properly and you eat them before the expiration date, they're usually fine. But if you're ever unsure about the storage or the packaging looks off, it's better to be safe and toss it.
Okay, so be mindful of storage, check those dates, and when in doubt, throw it out. I can handle that.
Good. Now let's move beyond the basics. What about some more advanced prevention strategies?
Advanced? You mean there's even more to learn about preventing botulism?
Always. For example, did you know that some food additives like nitrites and nitrates can help inhibit the growth of sea botulism?
Really? So processed meats are actually safer in this regard?
Well, it's not that simple. While those additives can help, processed meats often contain lots of salt and other preservatives, which might not be the healthiest choice overall. It's all about balance.
Right, everything in moderation. What other advanced strategies are out there?
Another interesting one is high-pressure processing. It can inactivate botulism toxins without affecting the flavor or texture of food.
High-pressure processing sounds pretty fancy.
It is. It's a relatively new technology, but it's becoming more popular as a safe and effective way to preserve food.
So food additives and high-pressure processing, anything else on the horizon?
There's always research going on into new prevention methods. Things like vaccines and even more effective antitoxins are being developed.
Vaccines for botulism. That's interesting.
It's still early stages, but it's a promising area of research.
So potentially a single vaccine could protect against all types of botulism.
That's the hope. It would be a huge breakthrough, especially for people at higher risk, like military personnel, first responders, lab workers who handle the toxin.
Wow, a real game changer. Okay, so better treatments and potentially even a vaccine. That's good news. What about preventative measures? Anything new happening there?
Public health initiatives are really important in preventing botulism. Things like food safety education programs and surveillance efforts, they're constantly being improved to prevent outbreaks.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged approach, better treatments, vaccines, and public awareness.
Exactly. It's a team effort involving scientists, healthcare professionals, policymakers, and even individuals like you who are taking the time to learn about this.
It's all about working together, right?
That's
You know, we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we move on, there's one more crucial aspect of prevention we need to talk about. Awareness.
You're absolutely right. Botulism is a serious illness, but it's often misunderstood and overlooked.
Probably because it's relatively rare. Right?
Yeah, that's part of it. But
Right.
even though it's rare, it can be deadly. So raising awareness about the risks, symptoms, and prevention strategies is so important.
So we all have a role to play in educating ourselves and others.
Absolutely. By sharing what we know with our friends, family, communities, we can help people make informed decisions about their health and safety.
I like that. Knowledge as empowerment.
Exactly, because when it comes to botulism, knowledge is the best defense.
Welcome back to our final part of our botulism deep dive. We've talked about the science, busted some myths, and learned how to prevent it. Now, I want to get a sense of botulism's real-world impact. Are there any cases that really stand out to you that highlight how dangerous it can be?
Yeah, one case that I always think about is this family who got botulism from some home-canned green beans.
Home-canned green beans. They sound harmless enough.
Well, it turned out they hadn't been canned properly, so it created this, low oxygen environment perfect for sea botulism to grow and produce its toxin.
So they basically unknowingly ate a jar of botulism.
Pretty much, yeah. Within hours of eating those beans, the whole family started experiencing those classic botulism symptoms, blurred vision, slurred speech, difficulty swallowing.
Those are some of the early signs we talked about.
Exactly.
Did they know what was going on?
Sadly, no. They thought it was just food poisoning at first. And they waited to go to the hospital. By the time they got there, their condition had gotten much worse.
That's scary. Did they recover?
Thankfully, yes, they got the antitoxin and supportive care, and everyone survived. But it really shows how important proper food handling is and getting medical help quickly.
It really shows that botulism can happen to anyone, even if you're usually careful.
Absolutely. It also shows how effective that antitoxin can be. It might not undo the nerve damage, but if you get it quickly enough, it can be life-saving.
So we've talked a lot about prevention and treatment. But what about the future? What's next? You mentioned research on a botulism vaccine.
Yeah, developing a botulism vaccine has been, well, it's been a challenge. It's really hard to create a vaccine that's safe and effective against all those different botulism neurotoxins.
Right, we talked about 5 types, but are there more?
Well, the 5 main types are what we focused on. But there are actually 7 different botulism neurotoxins. Each one has a unique structure and attacks the body differently.
So even more complex than I thought.
Yeah, but despite the challenges, there's been a lot of progress.
Hmm.
Researchers are working on different approaches, like using recombinant DNA technology and synthetic peptides. The goal is a single vaccine that could protect against all types of botulism.
Wow, so one vaccine for everything. That would be huge.
It would be a game changer, especially for people at higher risk. Military, first responders, lab workers.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Besides vaccines, are there any other promising developments?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of research on new and improved antitoxins, ones that are more potent, have fewer side effects, and are easier to produce.
So better treatments, and maybe even a vaccine someday. That's good to hear.
Oh,
What about prevention? Any new developments there?
public health initiatives are really important for prevention. Things like food safety education programs, surveillance to prevent outbreaks. Those are always being refined and improved.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely. It takes scientists, healthcare professionals, policymakers, and even individuals like you learning about this.
We all have a part to play.
Exactly.
Wow, we've really covered a lot in this deep dive, from the basics of food safety to the cutting edge of prevention.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is. It's made me realize just how common C. botulinum is in our environment.
It's a reminder that we share this planet with lots of microorganisms. Most of them are harmless or even good for us, but some, like C. botulinum, can be dangerous.
It's a delicate balance.
It is, and understanding that balance is important for protecting ourselves.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up our botulism journey. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, botulism is rare, but it can be deadly. But the key is, with the right knowledge and precautions, it's preventable. Take what you've learned, share it with others, and be an advocate for food safety and public health.
Knowledge really is power, especially when it comes to something like this.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into botulism. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.
And that's a wrap on our botulism adventure. We hope you enjoyed the journey and learned something new along the way. Stay tuned for our next deep dive, where we'll explore another fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring and keep learning.